Be here now. Just be here now.
Welcome to the Road Home Podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
All right. So, hi, everyone. This is Ethan Nichtern. This is the Road Home Podcast. I'm really happy and excited for the conversation ahead today. My guest today is friend, meditator, and author of the new book that's just out, Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation, Maud Newton. So, Maud, welcome to the Road Home Podcast.
Thanks, Ethan. You forgot to mention that you're also sometimes my teacher.
Well, that feels less relevant. I usually ask people to talk about their origin story with meditation, but I feel like so much of Buddhist thought and so much of what feels relevant right now are these questions of lineage and ancestry. And that's what your book, which is this amazingly researched and developed, is a personal story. It's a story of our kind of collective experiencing of ancestry and lineage. I feel like maybe talking about, and you wrote this book for 9 years, maybe talking about the origin story of the book first might maybe weave in sort of your experience as a meditator, or how Buddhist thought might intersect with this work. Because I have a lot of thoughts about ancestry and lineage from a Buddhist standpoint. But how did this book come about?
Yeah, so I come from a family that's pretty intense, a lot of really good stuff there, but a lot of dysfunctions, personal dysfunction, and also sort of a history in my family of participation in a lot of the really serious harms that lie at the foundation of this country, including slavery and my ancestors being the enslavers, and colonialism. So I would tell friends stories for many years about my family, and they would say, "Oh my God, you have to write a memoir." But I think if you've had a certain kind of traumatic childhood, you don't always necessarily want to spend years writing about it. So for a long time, I was really resistant. It sort of seemed like I would be kind of like locking myself in a closet with the dysfunctions of my childhood if I did that. But as I sort of started looking backward into my family, had a lot of therapy, started meditating, I became more interested in the ways that all of these patterns were sort of coming down through the family. And my agent asked me if I wanted to write a book about this after I wrote a piece that was published in Harper's. And I said, maybe, but, in the future. And she said, well, just think about what it might look like if you did want to write it now, which was a really great exercise, because I realized my whole life I've been fascinated by these questions of inheritance. And, in art, in music, and in everything, it's sort of like the thing that I gravitate toward. And so I realized I wanted to write about my family, but also about all these larger questions, genealogy, genetic genealogy. At the time, the idea of epigenetics and Intergenerational trauma was just sort of coming to the fore. So that, generational wealth, racism, colonialism, and then kind of veering into spirituality, which was the part that kind of scared me. I have a lot of religious extremism in my family, so I wasn't really sure where that would take me, but I was also excited about it.
Yeah. So, just in terms of the trauma, it does seem you didn't want to lock yourself in the closet with your personal traumas. You do talk about your parents and grandparents, but you do have a way in this book of kind of weaving in your personal story of the family that you personally related to, not going back 4 or 5 or 10 generations, and then weaving that in with sort of our larger, I don't know if we want to say obsession, but with like ancestry. Or one of the things you did was you talked a lot about the industry of looking that's grown of looking into one's ancestry. Like, so I did 23andme.com, but I never thought about it like, oh, this is like capital. This is like this is an industry. I didn't realize how large the industry of things like 23andme. I just thought it was like an interesting way to make connections. But it was fascinating because it feels like I always think like in America or in the United States, we often want to forget our past, but we're also simultaneously obsessed with it. So that's sort of interesting. Like we don't have any sense of history. We don't, it's not like Europe where you walk through cities and there's like these town squares or these amazing, architectural structures that tell you, oh, this is what this place was like 500 years ago. Like we have McDonald's, in our day. So I want, like, can you talk a little bit to like our simultaneous obsession with the past and like not knowing much about the past?
Yeah. So since the Enlightenment in the West, there's been this kind of notion that like, well, we don't have to be serfs because our ancestors were serfs, and therefore our ancestors and their history don't really matter. And of course, it's great not to be required to be something in particular because that's what your ancestors were. But at the same time, I think we can all see that our ancestors very directly and very literally affect who we are and what is possible for us, starting with our very bodies. So, the industry that's grown up and all the privacy considerations that I get into and all the ways it can be misused, I think is really, in my opinion, it's really motivated in large part by a kind of spiritual yearning more than a desire for fact. Like, of course, we want to know the facts, especially if we have a medical problem that we're trying to understand, or we, are cut off from our roots because of adoption or the Holocaust or slavery, so we're trying to find out facts, but we're also yearning for some deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world and the ways that we connect to something larger. And so this sort of like individualistic Western way of being in the world is, I think, really dissatisfying at a soul level for people. And, it's the more that I've thought about all of this and felt about all of this and, all the years I spent working on the book, it just came to seem so sort of ironic to me that we have this notion that if, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. But we think about that on a large scale, like, oh God, we don't want to replicate the fall of Rome, which of course we don't, but it's, there's no more intimate or more important connection to history for each of us than our ancestors and what they did. And there's sort of no more important way of looking at a culture at large than sort of like looking at the individual decisions that people made that led to, to where we are. So I think we're really trying to understand ourselves in this country. As you say, we don't have like monuments that go back 500 years. And unfortunately, most of the history of 500 years ago across this land has been eradicated by people like my ancestors. So, obviously, like the indigenous people and many traditions live on. But, we have devalued the actual history of this land. And so we're just kind of unmoored and searching for something.
Yeah. And also because the history of this land is so painful, and it seems like so much of that is what's in right-wing or conservative politics is, being attempted to be, erased, but swept under the rug would probably be a better analogy for it, because we haven't really reconciled with genocide, or being on someone else's land that we killed. And we haven't reconciled with having what, experts call the most brutal system of slavery that ever existed, right? And there's a sense of like, yeah, but that happened a long time ago. One of the things that I was thinking of as I was reading about your searching through your to go back more generations to pre-Civil War relatives was, so I'm half from the South too. My mother grew up in small town Arkansas, but I was feeling like, oh well, what saves me is I think almost everybody that I know of was a German or French immigrant in the like 1890s. That's my understanding of where. So it's interesting to say like, well, then they were Europeans who came over after slavery was abolished. And I found myself thinking like, is that really different? Does that like actually change the karma if you became an American white person after slavery? Obviously I don't think in my, bones or my genes of like, oh, okay, like this, they did these things directly, but we all still kind of benefited / didn't benefit from a karmic standpoint of the results of that, in terms of American life, et cetera. So do you have any thoughts about that? Like about like white friends who did not come from families that were here long enough ago, but if they had been here, probably would have participated in those same systems?
Yeah, I definitely do. I do think there's a difference, obviously there's a difference between being someone who enslaved people and being someone who did not enslave people. But yeah, the systemic racism, particularly at that time in the 1890s, but continuing today, it really underlies our whole society. And, in one way or another, we've all been complicit at some point in our lives, and even if not knowingly, and those of us who are white have benefited from our status and privilege as white people. And I think a lot of times if we look back into our stories, my ancestors have been on these lands for a very long time. The earliest arrival or the most recent arrival I could find was from 1803. So, wow. It's, there's a real history here for better and worse. But, a lot of us, when we look back, we can see that our ancestors made certain decisions that perpetuated slavery, sometimes more consciously than others. Racism, rather, systemic racism, not slavery. We're all implicated. And I think it's really important for all of us to really look at our role and our family's role. But those of us whose families actively participated in those harms, I think we have a real duty to step forward when we know about them and say, my ancestors did this. My ancestors participated in this. I find that a lot of people, myself included, can sometimes have this feeling when looking at the enormity of systemic racism, like, well, what can I do? And so I would encourage people who come from that history to really begin to think about, helping to create a mass movement of people coming forward and saying, my ancestors participated in this. And here's how I feel about that. And here are some stories that I know. And I think these conversations, we don't need to go find our Black friends and talk to them about this history, unless they want to talk to us. They know about this history.
Right.
We need to go to fellow white people and say, hey, look, my ancestors did this, and this is how I feel, and this is real.
Yeah. Just one more thought on this vein. How would you respond to somebody who says, I'm putting this in kind of Buddhist terminology, but like, I didn't do that. That's not my karma. Like, it's awful. I have feelings about it, but what am I actually supposed to do if this is a person who wasn't me, who maybe shared, a small percentage of my genetic coding, who lived at a different time? Like, how am I even supposed to take responsibility for something that I wasn't here for?
Sure. Well, in a very sort of practical and literal way, just coming forward and speaking about that, is a way of circumventing these laws that are trying to prevent people from talking about history. Because then it becomes not me lecturing you about our society. It becomes me sharing a personal story with you about something that my family did.
Yeah.
And how I feel about that. And I would encourage people to really be very tender and really, really become familiar with their feelings of avoidance and their feelings of wanting to disavow. Because it's true, I did not enslave people. I am not personally responsible for that. But the immense privilege that I have, because my ancestors did that, is undeniable. And even, in the decades after, the Civil War, and even in the decades before, some of my ancestors were very poor. So it's not, it doesn't mean that like you had to be a rich person. And if it's just important to acknowledge the reality of this, to really feel our way into it, and to really just kind of speak about it on a personal level, rather than a sort of lecturing theoretical level, in my opinion.
It does seem like that's a huge part about how defensiveness in general works. And what you're naming is just a basic mindfulness practice of noticing a tendency to avoid and trying to stay with something that's uncomfortable. But
absolutely,
it does seem that there's a basic pattern of if you're naming something, it's like you're provoking conflict rather than just naming, hey, this is true, this is real. Like, so it does seem like that's part of what we're up against, is that kind of collective defensiveness, right?
Yeah, and I think the more that I can say, in the book, I share letters that, my great aunt wrote about my great grandparents, and they ran a plantation in the mid 1900s, and So I'm just sharing stories. This is long after the Civil War, obviously, but there's still a lot of really racist stuff in there. It doesn't mean that I hate my great-grandparents. I'm sure that some of my family members would prefer that I not share this, but, that impulse to protect, that impulse to sort of like gerrymander what we tell about our families so that we're kind of leaving out those things, that we don't really want to think about or acknowledge. Those, a lot of times, are the really in this context, the things that we need to be bringing forward, I think. Not in a spirit of hating our ancestors, but in a spirit of saying, this is real. And this is how it manifested in my family.
Where do you think, you go into a very difficult kind of personal experiences and personal relationships, especially, with the relatives that came before you that were alive in your life. But something I've been thinking about just with people who we figure out have really confused patterns or do very harmful things. Where is the role for complexity? The times that I've written more in a memoir pattern, right? My last book, The Dharma of the Princess Bride, I talk a lot about my grandfather and step grandmothers, don't talk a lot about, but suicide. And, it's interesting because with my grandparents, especially on my dad's side, I had very good relationships, but there was clearly, after they passed away, a lot of complexity came forth. Not that they were, that side, everybody's an Ashkenazi Jew. Thank you, 23andMe, for letting me know that and making money off of it. But that's one of the things I've been thinking about in all these movements that are happening right now, is it doesn't seem like there's a lot of understanding or allowance for human complexity, that a person can do both harmful things and in other areas be a really great person, and I feel like there's different ways of looking at this. Like we might look at the psychological notion of compartmentalization or like the Jungian shadow or something, but it does feel like a lot of the conversations, to me, this is just my editorializing, and I'm not at all here talking about slavery or genocide. I'm talking about just our relatives who are, problematic people in their interpersonal relationships. It doesn't feel like our conversations about these things have gotten to the level of nuance about, like, how do we hold both this person did a lot of good and caused a lot of harm?
Yeah, I have found spiritual practices around ancestors really helpful with that. I think that's right. And obviously, when we're looking at something like slavery, or we're looking at something like genocide, as you say, that's not a time where we want to introduce nuance, even though there may be nuance in individual stories. What we want to do is acknowledge, in my opinion, that those things happened, and maybe in our own families, we want to talk about, about the nuances around that in our particular families. But yeah, one thing that's been really interesting for me is to realize that even in European countries, there was a tradition of ancestral spirituality. And there was a notion that the state of the dead mattered for the state of the living. So there was a notion that, these days we might talk about it in terms of wellness, or we might think about it in terms of sort of like elevation. But, if your ancestors did terrible things, or were a terrible person, or were a complex person in life, or if your ancestors were wonderful, 100% perfect, you would perform the same rituals. You would perform the same rituals of respect. You would perform the same rituals of returning to the grave. You would contemplate your ancestors and your relationship to them as continuing. And to me, that really opens up a whole different way of looking at it, whether or not we believe that we're actually sort of engaging with an ancestor or we're imaginatively engaging with our notion of an ancestor. It's really helpful to kind of think like, oh, this isn't a static person who died, who I have to defend or not defend. You know, this is a sort of like complex person, and we can engage with them almost the way we would with a living person, in terms of our sort of feelings about them. And I've found it to be helpful to sort of even like imagine ancestors before the bad thing, whatever that bad thing may be. You know, so in my case, imagining ancestors who predated slavery, and imagining that those ancestors would also view this as a problem in the line, you know, has been helpful to me as either a spiritual or psychological exercise, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah. So I would love to shift gears for a while and talk about, you know, spiritual approach to ancestry. And in Buddhist terms, this also makes me think of the concept of lineage, you know, which is incredibly important. And it's interesting studying things like Tibetan or Zen Buddhism. There's a lot of times part of the ceremony, you know, in chants and things is to invoke the so-called masters of the lineage, you know, and sometimes in daily chants, like there's in Tibetan Buddhism, the Kagyu lineage, there's a whole like sort of named lineage of masters I remember Rev Angel Kyoto Williams talking about a chant in the Soto Zen tradition where you name the 72 patriarchs of the lineage and said, isn't it interesting? They were all patriarchs, but, and, you know, a lot of times it feels kind of distant because you may have read a few of the stories, sort of spiritual biographies or hagiographies of these masters. And some of them you can relate to, and some of them you're like, oh, that's not really this feels so ancient and distant. But it's interesting because I think in a lot of ways, the mindfulness movement kind of misses this notion of lineage. Like there's actually a lot of mindfulness and wellness influencers who can't even say like what the origin source. I mean, a lot of them can, but a lot of them can't even say sort of what the origin source of their lineage is, which it can be complex. It can be multiple influences, but there's an aspect in Buddhism of the lineage kind of keeping you honest because it keeps you anchored to like, I'm representing more than just myself. But the other aspect is, I think, and this gets to it with the ceremonies, there's a sense of love and support. Like that you actually, in Tibetan Buddhism, visualize the lineage kind of giving you energy, giving you awakened energy. And so, Lama Rod Owens talks about this in his work on Buddhism about you relying on the ancestors, you know, like as a support structure. So, I don't know. It doesn't feel like that's always available to us as American white people to look back when we don't know our history, and also when we have these really problematic histories, as you're naming in Ancestor Trouble. So, what do you think about the relationship between like your work and lineage or ancestry as a power source of one's own wisdom?
Yeah, well, I will say that studying Buddhism with you, I don't consider myself a Buddhist, and I'm not a very good student.
Oh, shut up. Hush. I like the term Buddhish, if that's okay.
Yeah. But I feel like that sort of opened up avenues for some of this other work that I've been drawn to. And I love the idea of acknowledging lineages, you know, I I sort of think of it as a companion to something like land acknowledgement. You know, anytime we can acknowledge, you know, a history that connects to where we are, the more kind of grounded we as sort of rootless Americans, you know, particularly those of us whose ancestors have been here for a while and are, you know, white people, you know, the more grounded we can feel. But yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, kind of imagining or relating to, or however you want to put it, you know, lineages that extend beyond the Trouble has been really powerful for me. So, you know, I've worked with a teacher to acknowledge Larissa Noonan, who, like me, comes out of a really fundamentalist background, and you know, so she's been sort of helpful with this. But yeah, there's a notion of kind of connecting with or imagining, however you want to put it, an ancestor on a particular line, very far back, someone who is elevated or well, who's not mired in this problem and is sort of connected in a positive sense to the people who came before. And then there's a sense of working your way down, really having this well sort of imagined or whatever ancestor doing the work for you of sort of healing that line, so that then there's a sense of the ancestors in that entire line being a source of support rather than a source of being cut off and having done this harm that we have this relationship to. And you know, I recognize that it can sound a bit inaccessible and out there to certain people. But again, you know, if you imagine it, you know, I approached it in a sort of experimental way, I would say. I was like, well, I don't know. You know, I've spent most of my adult life avoiding any kind of extreme spirituality or really any kind of spirituality other than Buddhism. And yeah, but I found it really powerful. And something that another teacher said to me, Thea Ma Sher, said to me was, you know, why should we imagine that what we might envision would be different, you know, sort of independent from our ancestors' legacies in us, which again, you know, is debatable, but I found it sort of helpful, and leaning into these other ways of thinking about family and finding support, even on these lines that seemed very troubled. It's really been transformative because I've been able, you know, with my mindfulness background and my many years of therapy, to really look at my family and see more clearly the negative patterns and see the strengths more clearly as well.
Did you, through the long process of writing this book, like when you started writing this book, did you have I mean, obviously when you write a book, you want to write a book, right? And I know you had, you know, a big literary blog. So I also imagine people were telling you for a while, like, write a book, you know, and this was, my guess is this was the subject matter that really called to you. But did you have a sense of like the personal journey you were looking to go through with it? I mean, I know the subtitle of the book is A Reckoning and a Reconciliation. So did you have a sense of like, here's what, to use a, you know, you use the word, I always wonder what we actually mean when we say this, what a kind of, how this book could be a healing journey for you? Or was it just like, I have something to express and I'm really interested in this and this is what I want to write about?
I think the answer to all of that is yes. Yeah, even the things that sort of contradict each other. I was very interested in the spiritual aspect of it. And I was very kind of suspicious of it and afraid of it at the same time. When I was a kid, my mom started a church in our living room, and it was like a holy roller, casting out demons, speaking in tongues kind of situation. It was pretty intense and scary. And my lawyer father was not into it. But he was a Presbyterian, also very kind of religious in a certain sort of way. So I reacted to my background by avoiding religion, declaring myself a fervent agnostic, and being terrified that I would have a religious conversion and start a church in my living room. When I started to approach this ancestor spirituality, I did it in a way that's very familiar for me. Lots of reading, lots of deep research, and I think people who are interested in this will be like, awesome, you've done the work. And people who aren't, I've seen a couple reviews on Goodreads where people are like, a little bit of this goes a long way. But I really went into it, but I was conscious of not wanting to just approach it from a sociological perspective. So at a certain point, I had to figure out how I was going to access this. And I didn't feel comfortable for myself going into the ancestor traditions of a people who are not the people I come from. I'm not saying that it's wrong for anyone else to do so, but because of my particular ancestral harms, I was like, I'm going to try to find my way to this as a white person of European origin, while benefiting from the wisdom of many people who are not from that background. And so, when I first went to an intensive, it was with the organization Ancestral Medicine. And I didn't work directly with the guy who founded that, but I have worked with some of the teachers who trained with him. And I really wasn't sure what to expect. And I was kind of scared. I was even scared, like, God, what if I open some kind of like demonic thing? I really didn't know what I was doing. But so I just sort of approached it experimentally, deciding to see what came up. And it ended up just being really powerful for me. And I began to feel like I had access to this very personal kind of divinity, for lack of a better word, that the people I came from had done these really terrible things, but there were also these different kinds of wisdom and power that I had access to. And that was really great. So I think I wanted to end up where I ended up when I started writing the book, but I had no idea how I would get there. And I didn't really, at the outset, view it as a healing journey exactly.
Yeah, it's writing a book it's interesting because for me it's kind of grueling, but it's something I have to do. So I overall I think it adds to my sanity for sure, but it doesn't. It's not like it feels like a good, meditation doesn't always feel that way either, but it doesn't feel like a good massage or something. Like sometimes it's just like, all right, well, I dug through the rock a little bit more.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't like a chill sort of like, oh, now I'm going to like sit down and have some fun today at my computer. It was definitely a lot of intense research, a lot of intense soul searching, a lot of intense reckoning. Originally, I had imagined the subtitle would be A Reckoning and an Embrace, which feels accurate. But, I didn't want to suggest that I was embracing the harms. And I thought a lot actually about your book while I was writing. and about your grandparents too. I wrote a little bit about your book just briefly in there, but yeah, I feel like we maybe approach writing from a similar kind of perspective in a way.
But it's also, I wanted to circle back to, it's this question of using spirituality related to ancestry. One thing I mean, not everybody has the intense fundamentalist experience of their mother, starting a church in the living room. But I do find, especially in the United States, in the Western world, a lot of people who are interested in Buddhism, or at least interested in mindfulness practices, come from feeling repelled, having grown up, usually in one of the sects of American Christianity, where there is more dogma. People will often say, well, I'm interested in Buddhism, but I don't want to join anything or do anything too woo because I'm a recovering Catholic, is a term I hear personally quite a lot. But it's interesting because, and this is a larger conversation about sort of the adoption of mindfulness in Buddhism in the West, that people, they like Buddhism because it is more scientific than other, spiritual traditions. I mean, especially I think if you go back to the style of the founder of the tradition, it's been more religious at various times through history, but there's this access line. It's a contemplative, it's scientific, it's psychological. So people can find a doorway into the practices, not feeling like anybody's going to ask them to do something on faith with some invisible situation. But at the same time, Buddhism it's adopted so many different shamanic or ceremonial or ways of bringing that psychology to look at the invisible world. And it does feel like at a certain point to work with one's ancestry, because it is in our DNA, because it is, and it's at its best, it's what I like to call your lineage is like the Jedis in the forest, the force ghosts, at its very best. So to get in there and do that work, it does feel like you need more medicinal, indigenous, or shamanic or spiritual approaches, right? So that seems like that's a big leap for people, is to bring back in some transformed sense of how can I relate to ceremony or et cetera.
Absolutely. And part of my continuing discussion within myself about Buddhism is sort of my, how much it's transformed my life for the better, and how much I don't know still about the tradition, and the extent to which I have a sort of obligation. What is my obligation to this tradition? Which has been so personally helpful to me, and which has this rich history that, my people don't come from. And so that's definitely a question that's really alive for me whenever I think about my meditation practice. One thing that I've found really useful in doing the kind of spiritual work that I do is a kind of doorway, was the idea of breathing in, harmful or negative things, and then breathing out. I feel like, there's a real relationship with that kind of imaginative or spiritual work, however you want to look at it. That it really feels connected to this other work that I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I mean, for me, sort of overcoming my resistance, I consider myself now a recovering agnostic. And, and I consider myself kind of a very inept and beginning practitioner of sort of earth kinship and, for lack of, hopefully it's not too appropriating to say, sort of more indigenous, earth honoring, ancestor honoring traditions. And, Yeah. And sort of also doing this work for me and sort of having this sense of connection back through time, through thousands and thousands of years to ancestors, makes me feel more connected to the earth somehow, in a more kind of grounded way, and less separated from it. I feel like I've veered away from your question though. So if you want to like gently shepherd me back in, that's cool.
Oh yeah, no, just I don't think you veered away from it at all. But podcasts are about kind of taking things and going in our own directions. So no, the question was just about how to find re-find a genuine relationship to spirituality that has some of these qualities of reconciliation, or at least being in dialogue with our ancestry. Like, thinking of some of the things you named, like even something like Dia de los Muertos in the Mexican, tradition, which is such an amazing, it's so much better than, I hate to say this, but it's so much better than Halloween, I'm probably going to get in trouble for saying that, but because it's so spiritual, I mean, Halloween's a great way to connect with your friends and children, but it feels like we have to rediscover our spirituality, right? We can't be sheerly scientific when we're talking about our ancestry.
Yeah. And, for people who might be sort of like curious about this, but not really kind of interested in or ready to go there, Jung is a really interesting part of my entry into this. I am not a Jungian. I find a lot of his ideas really frustrating, particularly his ideas about male and female and all of that. I'm just like, oh, get out of here with that shit. But, at the same time, I have come to sort of view Jung differently. I have a book called Lament of the Dead that's a sort of discussion between two Jung scholars of the Red Book. And they talk about how, the dead were very important to Jung. And also, arguably, he wasn't putting forward his kind of interpretations and visions as like the guidebook for all of us. He was saying, we all need that. We all need to sort of relate with our ancestors and their legacies and their unfinished business and all of that. Like, we can't really move forward until we acknowledge the dead and the sort of like pain that they felt and the pain that they inflicted.
Well, this might be a good place to leave off, but I want to give a big plug because Maud Newton's book, Ancestor Trouble, A Reckoning and a Reconciliation, is out as of this week. And it's not just me interviewing a friend. The book has gotten many starred reviews and is on several really major lists of anticipated books of the month and year. And it's one of those nonfiction books that I really get a lot out of, where there's a very personal quality mixed with really learning something. So I really want to highly recommend it. And I found it to be what I like to call stealth dharma, where something's not overtly dharmic, but is about something that we all really need to know more about. So please, everybody, go pick up Ancestor Trouble. I'm going to recommend you get an independent bookseller, please. And that's something I care about. And Maud, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Ethan, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And I love talking with you. I can't wait until you have some in-person weekend retreats again.
Yeah. Let's and let's make prayers for a stable world and inclusive world where that's possible. I know we're all worried about that right now. Yes. All right. Well, for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.